I can't believe you're really wearing that. That thing looks like it came from a yard sale. Bob stood there, the weight of the room pressing in on him. Marine Captain Carter's salute was still hanging in the air, and the silence around them felt heavy, thick with something unspoken. The young Marines, still frozen in place, couldn't look away from Bob. They had no idea who they had been mocking. Bob's hands rested calmly at his sides, but his mind drifted once again. Carter had acknowledged him. He didn't need to explain, but he was going to. Ghost Recon, Carter had said. It wasn't just a name. It was a legacy. Bob had carried it with him for years. The ink of that tattoo, just a faint reminder of a chapter most people would never understand. But Carter did. Carter knew. Bob had been through a lot. They all had. He had seen his brothers in arms fall, heard their last words, and had to live with the weight of those memories. It had never been about the medals or the recognition. It had been about survival. It had been about the men beside him. And that tattoo? It wasn't just a symbol. It was a bond, a promise made in the dark, unseen moments of war. Bob didn't need to say more. The Marines in the diner began to shift, some looking at the floor, others at each other, as if silently processing what they had just witnessed. Finally, one of them, a young man with nervous eyes, took a step forward. "Sir," the Marine began, his voice unsure but sincere, I didn't know. I didn't realize who you were." Bob turned slowly, his eyes locking with the young man's. There was no anger there, only the kind of understanding that came from years of experience. Bob nodded slightly, acknowledging the apology, but he didn't speak. The lesson had been learned, and sometimes that was enough. Carter, still standing at attention, glanced at the young Marines and then back at Bob. "You've earned this," he said, his voice low but steady. "Not just the respect, but the recognition. I'm sorry it took so long." Bob looked at Carter, and for the first time in years, a small smile tugged at his lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The weight of the past few moments lifted. And for the first time in a long while, Bob felt seen. He didn't need the recognition. He had never sought it. But standing here, in this diner, surrounded by young men who had underestimated him, it felt good to be understood. He had carried the burden of their misconceptions long enough. Now, it was time to let them go. The young Marines began to approach, one by one, slowly at first, and then with more confidence. They weren't just apologizing anymore. They were showing respect. The air in the diner had shifted, and for the first time, it felt like the room was filled with something real. Honor, recognition, and the quiet understanding of what it meant to serve. Bob didn't need to say anything more. His actions had spoken for him, and in that moment, that was enough. I knew it was time to leave. The diner had grown quieter, the energy now shifting. The air that had once been filled with mocking laughter and dismissive glares now held something else: respect. I took a deep breath and looked around at the young Marines who had once mocked me. Their faces were no longer filled with contempt, but with awe. I could tell that something inside them had changed, and for the first time, I felt like I had given them something that would last. But the moment was fleeting. Time didn't stop for moments like this, and neither could I. The past was always going to be with me. I had walked away from it once, but it had always followed, waiting for the right time to remind me of what I had lost, what I had gained, and what I still carried. The tattoo wasn't just a symbol of my past. It was a piece of my soul. It was the reminder that no matter how old I got, no matter how much time passed, I had lived through something most people couldn't imagine. And I wouldn't forget. I wasn't the same man I had been when I wore that patch on my shoulder. But I wasn't a stranger to it, either. Carter was still there, standing across the table, watching me carefully. I could see the respect in his eyes. It wasn't the respect of a Marine who had been trained to follow orders. It was the respect of someone who had seen what a man was, capable of when pushed to the limit. "You're not what I thought you were," Carter said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was quieter now, as if he was still processing what had happened. "And I think I've got a lot to learn from you." I smiled slightly. There was a certain humility in the way he said it, and for a brief moment, I felt like the past had come full circle. I had spent my life in the shadows, but now I was standing in the light, and it felt good to be seen. But as I looked around at the Marines, I couldn't help but think that they didn't really understand. Not yet. They hadn't seen the things I had seen, hadn't fought the battles I had fought. They couldn't know, and maybe that was for the best. Maybe some things were meant to be left behind. I turned to leave, but as I did, Carter spoke again. Sir, if you ever need anything, you know where to find me. I nodded. I'll keep that in mind. The door swung open, and I stepped out into the cool air, the quiet of the parking lot settling around me. The world felt a little different now, a little more real, a little more alive. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was walking towards something worth living for. The drive back to my apartment was quiet, the kind of silence that only came after a meaningful moment. The Marines had gone back to their usual chatter, but something was different now. They had learned something today, something that would stick with them for the rest of their lives. I knew it, even if they didn't realize it yet. It wasn't about respect in the usual sense. It wasn't just about honoring me. It was about understanding that everyone, no matter their age, their experience, or their past, had a story. A story that could shape the world in ways they couldn't yet grasp. And that tattoo? It was a piece of that story. I pulled into the parking lot and sat for a moment in the stillness of my car. The weight of the day was starting to settle in. The things I had done, the things I had seen, they had always stayed with me, in the quiet moments when I was alone. I wasn't ashamed of my past, but I had long since accepted that it wasn't something people needed to understand. It was mine to carry. I stepped out of the car and made my way to the door of the building. The familiar sounds of the city hummed in the background, but it felt distant now, like I was seeing it through a fog. Maybe it was the years of service, or maybe it was just the weight of age, but everything felt different. More distant. More separate. I unlocked the door and walked inside. The small apartment as quiet as I remembered. It was a far cry from the places I had lived during my service, but it was home now. I sat on the couch, my eyes scanning the room. There were pictures on the wall of old friends, some of them no longer with us. A few medals sat on a shelf, just out of sight, not because I was hiding them, but because I didn't need them to define who I was. I wasn't a soldier anymore. I wasn't part of that life. But it had shaped me. It had made me who I was. My eyes fell on the old rifle sitting in the corner of the room. It wasn't the same as the one I used in the field, but it was a reminder. A reminder of how much had been left behind. A reminder of the things I had seen, the things I had lost, and the things I would never forget. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the next generation. The ones who would carry the weight forward when I was gone. They might not understand everything now, but one day, maybe they would. Maybe they'd understand that the past wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was something to honor. As I sat there, I felt a calm settle over me. It wasn't peace, but it was close enough. I had walked a long road, and maybe, just maybe, today had been the final step towards something I had been missing. Understanding. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough. The days that followed felt like a slow, steady hum. The city, which had always seemed so noisy, now felt like a distant memory. I found myself thinking about the Marines, about the way they looked at me differently now. The world had always moved fast, but lately, I felt like I was watching it from a distance, like I was no longer part of it. The phone hadn't rung in days, and I had started to enjoy the quiet. It had been a long time since I'd been this still. But something was nagging at me, a feeling I couldn't shake. The diner was still there, the same place where everything had started. The same group of young Marines who had once laughed at me. They had seen something in me that they hadn't before, but the world still hadn't stopped moving. I knew that. I knew that their lives were still speeding ahead, full of ambition, of futures yet to be written. And mine had already been written. It was in the memories I carried, in the places I had been, and in the things I had done. It was in the tattoo, the one that had once been mocked, but now had meaning. It wasn't just ink on skin. It was a testament to everything I had given, everything I had lost. I spent the next few days cleaning up old boxes, sorting through mementos from a lifelong past. The photographs, the letters, the medals, the stories of a time when the world was different, when the weight of the past didn't feel so heavy. As I sifted through them, I couldn't help but think about the Marines. They had learned something, but I had learned something, too. It wasn't about the recognition. It wasn't about the respect. It was about understanding. Understanding that no matter how much time passed, no matter how many years went by, I was still a part of something. The world had changed, but the bonds I had formed, the memories I carried, they were still there. It was in the way the Marines looked at me, with a newfound respect. It was in the way Carter had acknowledged me, the way he had saluted me. It was in the quiet nods from the other Marines as they left the diner. their faces reflecting something they hadn't had before, understanding. I put the boxes away and sat by the window, watching the sun set. The world was still moving. The city still bustled. But for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had found my place in it again. I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need to fight for respect. It had been given, quietly, in a diner, by a group of young men who had seen me for who I truly was. And that, I realized, was enough. I woke up the next morning to the sound of the city outside my window, the same hum of traffic, the same distant noise of people rushing through their day. But inside, it felt different. The sun was filtering through the blinds, casting soft shadows across the room. I hadn't slept that well in a long time. Maybe it was the feeling of finally being understood, or maybe it was the peace of knowing that I had left something behind, something that was worth leaving. As I sat there, staring out at the world, I couldn't help but think about the Marines. I had walked away from my past for so long, buried it under layers of silence and distance. But that day in the diner, something had shifted. I didn't need to carry the weight of their mockery anymore. I didn't need to prove anything to them. The recognition had come, not in the way I had once expected, but in the way that mattered. It had come through understanding. And in that understanding, there was a certain kind of freedom. I wasn't just the old man with the tattoo anymore. I wasn't the relic of a past that had been forgotten. I was a man who had lived, who had fought, and who had earned his place. I made my coffee slowly, savoring the warmth of the cup in my hands. The quiet of the apartment was comforting now, not oppressive like it had been before. I had spent so many years alone, thinking that solitude was the only way to survive, the only way to keep the ghosts at bay. But now, it felt different. The past wasn't something to run from. It was a part of me, and that was okay. I didn't need to hide it anymore. I thought about the young Marines, about their faces when they had realized who I was. They had seen me, really seen me, for the first time. And in doing so, they had seen something bigger than just a man with a past. They had seen what it meant to honor that past, to respect the sacrifices made, even if they weren't always understood. I knew their respect was genuine, but I also knew that they couldn't fully understand. Not yet. Maybe one day they would. But for now, I was content with what had happened. I had found a kind of peace in the quiet of my apartment, in the knowledge that I had made a difference, even in the smallest of ways. The day went on, the city's rhythm never changing. But for me, it felt like something had shifted, like the world had come into focus for the first time in a long while. I wasn't just a survivor. I was a part of something bigger. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. I woke up the next day with a strange sense of calm that had settled over me. The quiet apartment felt less like a place to hide and more like a home. For the first time in years, I felt at peace with my past. The old man, the one with the tattoo, the one who had been laughed at and ignored, he wasn't just a memory anymore. He was someone that had earned respect, even if it had taken a while for others to see it. I had walked through my life thinking that the past was something to be buried, hidden, away from the world. But the truth was, it wasn't just my past. It was a part of me, and it always would be. The Marines had seen that, even if they hadn't fully understood it. They respected it, and that was all that mattered. I made my coffee, savoring the warmth as it filled the cup. The smell of the brew mingled with the quiet of the apartment. I wasn't looking for anything else. The respect I had gotten from the Marines had been enough. It had been earned through actions, through years of service, through sacrifices that had left scars I didn't always want to talk about. But it didn't matter anymore. The world was still turning outside my window. The sun was still rising and setting, and the world kept moving forward, whether I was a part of it or not. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I belonged. I wasn't just a relic of a time long past. I wasn't the ghost I had once thought myself to be. I was here. I was living. The phone rang, breaking my thoughts. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway. "Hello," I said, my voice rough from the early morning quiet. "Mr. Fisher?" the voice on the other end asked. "This is Captain Carter. I was hoping we could talk." For a second, I froze. "Carter? The Marine captain from the diner? What's this about?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. "I've been thinking about what happened the other day," he said. "About the respect you earned. I wanted to tell you that it made a difference to me." I leaned back in the chair, the warmth of the coffee still in my hands. "It wasn't just about respect," I said, my voice steady. "It was about understanding." Carter was silent for a moment. "I get that now," he said. I didn't before, but I do now. And I just wanted to thank you for that." The words lingered in the air for a moment, and I let them sink in. I wasn't looking for gratitude, but hearing it felt good. "You're welcome," I said finally. "You've earned it," he replied, and I could hear the sincerity in his voice. "Maybe we can meet again sometime," I said, surprising myself. I hadn't planned on saying that, but it felt right. "I'd like that," Carter replied. We ended the call shortly after, but the conversation stayed with me. It was something I didn't expect, a connection that had been formed without words, but with understanding. I hadn't just earned their respect. I had earned their recognition, and that meant something. The world still moved outside my window, but it felt different now. It wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about what came next. And maybe, just maybe, there was more ahead for me than I had thought. The next week passed slowly, but with a sense of quiet satisfaction I hadn't felt in years. The phone calls came less frequently, but the ones that did come felt different. I'd answer the phone, and there would be a voice on the other end, not asking for anything, but just talking, almost like an old friend checking in. It wasn't much, but it was something I hadn't had in a long time, a connection that went beyond the surface. One evening, as the sun was setting and the streets outside my apartment grew quieter, I decided to take a walk. The city was never truly silent, but the peaceful hum of it at night was something I had come to appreciate. I walked along the streets, past the familiar buildings, each one with its own story, its own history. The years had passed, and so much had changed. But I was still here, still moving forward. It wasn't about the past anymore. It was about what came next. As I walked, I thought about the Marines again. I had made my peace with them, with the world around me. But something about the respect I had earned, the way they had looked at me differently, stuck with me. It wasn't just about the recognition, it was about the understanding. And for the first time in a long time, I realized that understanding was what had always been missing. When I had walked into that diner, they had seen a relic of the past, a forgotten soldier with nothing more to offer. But by the time I walked out, they had seen me for who I really was, not just a man from another time, but someone who had lived, who had served, and who still had something to offer. It was more than I had ever expected. The phone call from Captain Carter a few days ago echoed in my mind. He had thanked me for my service, for the lessons I had unknowingly taught him. I wasn't sure how much I had taught him, but the fact that he had taken the time to call and say that meant something. It meant I hadn't just faded into the background. I hadn't been forgotten. There was a place for me here, even if it was small. As I continued walking, the weight of the day started to lift. I wasn't alone. I had never really been alone, even if I had thought I was. There were people who understood. There were people who respected what I had done, even if they didn't fully understand it. And that, I realized, was enough. I didn't need to explain myself anymore. The world would keep turning, and I would keep walking along with it. As the night deepened, I found myself standing at a corner, watching the lights flicker. On in the distance, I smiled to myself, feeling the satisfaction of knowing that I had made a difference, even in a small way. I was part of something, and that was enough. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was fading away. I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. I woke up the next morning with the sunlight streaming through the blinds, casting warm streaks across the room. It was a new day, a quiet one, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside me. The world still moved outside, fast and relentless, but there was a calm that had settled in my chest, something I hadn't felt in a long time. I stretched slowly, allowing the stretch to reach deep into my bones, feeling the years of service, of stories, and of silence fade a little further into the past. Today felt like a day for change, a day to embrace what had been and what could still be. I made my coffee, the familiar aroma filling the air. It wasn't the rush of early mornings during my service days, but a quiet ritual that felt grounding. As I sat at the table, the sound of the city outside almost felt distant, like it belonged to another world. I thought back to the phone call with Captain Carter a few days ago. It had been short, but it had meant something. He had thanked me for the lessons, for something I hadn't even known I had taught. I hadn't expected that kind of recognition. It wasn't what I had been looking for, but it was something I had earned, quietly, over the years. There was a moment of peace, a moment of understanding, that had passed between us. He saw me. He saw the man behind the tattoo, behind the years of silence. It wasn't just about respect anymore. It was about seeing the truth of who I was. I put down the coffee mug and stood up. The apartment felt almost too quiet now, as if the stillness had settled into every corner of the room. But the quiet was different from before. This wasn't loneliness anymore. It was a kind of peace I hadn't known I needed. The phone rang again, breaking the calm, and I picked it up without thinking. "Hello," I said, my voice steady, familiar. "Mr. Fisher?" The voice on the other end was calm, respectful. "It's Captain Carter. I was wondering if you'd be interested in joining us for a ceremony next week. It's nothing official, just a small thing. But I think it's important." I felt a shift in my chest. A ceremony? It wasn't something I had expected, but the invitation felt right. It felt like the next step. "What's it about?" I asked, curiosity rising. "It's a small tribute," Carter replied, "to honor those who served. We'd like to include you." For a moment, there was silence on the other end. Not awkward, but meaningful. I thought about it for a second. It wasn't the kind of recognition I had ever sought, but it felt like the right thing to do. "I'll be there," I said finally, the words feeling like a promise, one I had made long ago but hadn't been able to fulfill until now. "Thank you," Carter said, his voice warmer now. "I think it'll mean a lot to the others, too." I hung up the phone and sat back in my chair, the room feeling fuller now, not with noise, but with something deeper. Something had changed, something had been acknowledged, and now it was time to move forward. The world outside hadn't stopped, but I was ready to face it again. I had been seen, and in that moment, that was enough. The day of the ceremony arrived sooner than I expected. I had agreed to go, but I wasn't sure what to expect. The phone call from Captain Carter had been simple enough, but I still felt a sense of hesitation in the pit of my stomach. I hadn't been a part of anything like this in years. The thought of standing in front of others, having them look at me with respect, made me uneasy. But I had agreed, and now it was time. I put on my jacket, the one I had worn for years, and looked at myself in the mirror. I didn't look any different, but there was something inside me that had changed. I wasn't just the old man with the faded tattoo anymore. I wasn't just a reminder of a time long past. I had been seen, understood, and maybe that was enough. I drove to the ceremony, taking the same route I had taken hundreds of times before. The roads were familiar, the faces on the sidewalks just as fleeting as always. But this time, there was a sense of anticipation in the air. I pulled into the parking lot and walked toward the building, the sound of my boots on the pavement echoing in the quiet morning. When I entered, I was greeted by a few familiar faces, people from the old days, soldiers I had served with. Their eyes flicked to me, and for a moment, I saw a recognition, not just of my face, but of the things I had carried with me. They had seen me before, but today, there was something different in their gaze. Captain Carter was waiting for me near the back. He smiled when he saw me, and I nodded in return. "Glad you could make it," he said, his voice warm and genuine. I hadn't expected to feel welcome, but standing there, surrounded by people who understood, it felt different. It felt like I was part of something again. The ceremony wasn't grand. There were no long speeches or awards being handed out. It was simple, just a few of us gathered together to remember. We stood in a circle, each of us with our own memories, our own stories, and we shared them quietly. As I listened to the others speak, I realized something. We were all connected, not just by the past, but by the respect we had for each other. It wasn't about who had done what or who had been where. It was about what we had given and what we had received in return. When it was my turn to speak, I felt the weight of the room on me. But it wasn't the heavy weight of judgment or expectation. It was the weight of understanding. I didn't need to say much. I simply spoke from the heart, about the things I had learned, the people I had known, and the things I had seen. There were no grand revelations, no heroic tales, just truth. And in that truth, I found something I hadn't expected. The connection I had been searching for, the understanding, had always been there. It wasn't in the medals, the awards, or the recognition. It was in the quiet moments, the moments where we saw each other for who we really were. After the ceremony, we shared a drink, but it wasn't the kind of celebration I had been used to. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about being together, about remembering, not just the past, but the present. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was alone. I didn't feel like I had to carry the weight of my past by myself. And as I walked out of that building, I realized something. The world had never stopped for me. It had never waited for me to catch up. But today, it felt like I had finally caught up to it. The days after the ceremony felt like a shift in the rhythm of my life. The air outside seemed lighter, the sun brighter. I didn't know if it was because of the ceremony or the simple realization that I had finally let go of the weight I had been carrying for years. It was subtle, but I could feel the change in the way I moved through the world. The phone didn't ring often, but when it did, it felt different. The calls weren't just about logistics or routine. They were about connection, a deeper understanding of what it meant to be human, to have lived, to have experienced. One evening, as I walked home after a quiet dinner at the same diner, I noticed something that I hadn't seen before. A young man, probably in his mid-20s, walked by with a group of friends. He looked at me and stopped for a moment, his friends continuing ahead. He was staring at me, and I could tell he was trying to figure something out. I didn't say anything. I just kept walking, but then he spoke. "Excuse me, sir," he said, a little hesitantly. I turned to him, curious. "Yes. I just wanted to say thank you for what you did," he said, his voice soft, almost shy. I stopped for a moment, unsure of what to say. But there it was again, the understanding, the connection. He wasn't looking for anything from me. He wasn't asking for a story or a lesson. He simply saw me, really saw me. "You're welcome," I said, my voice steady. I did what I had to do. He nodded, a slight smile forming on his face before he turned to catch up with his friends. But something about that moment stuck with me. It wasn't just the thank you. It was the way he had recognized something in me that I hadn't fully acknowledged in myself. Maybe it wasn't just about the past, but about what we carried with us, how it shaped us. I spent the next few weeks thinking about that encounter, about how often we go through life not really seeing each other, not really recognizing the stories that people carry. We're all walking around with our own histories, our own scars, but we don't always take the time to look, to listen, to understand. I thought back to the young Marines in the diner, to how they had looked at me when they realized who I was. And I realized that maybe, just maybe, that was what we all needed. We needed to stop and look, to see each other, to really see each other. And in that moment, I understood something else. I wasn't just the old man with the tattoo. I wasn't just the forgotten soldier from a time gone by. I was part of something bigger. I was part of a story, a history that wasn't just mine, but one that we all carried together. The world kept moving, fast and loud as ever, but I was no longer just drifting through it. I was part of it, and that was enough. The weeks seemed to slip by, each one blending into the next with a gentle rhythm I hadn't experienced in years. The city moved at its usual pace, but I felt as if I had found a new way of moving within it. There were still moments of quiet contemplation, but now they didn't feel like empty silences. They were filled with a kind of peace I hadn't realized I was searching for. I continued my daily routines, but with a new awareness. I paid attention to the little things, how the light changed during the day, the sound of footsteps on the pavement, the simple interactions between strangers. It was as if I was finally seeing the world in a different way, noticing the beauty in its small, often overlooked details. I would still visit the diner from time to time, sometimes to sit in the corner and watch the world go by, other times to chat with the familiar faces that had become a part of my life. The young Marines, the ones who had once laughed at me, would often stop by, and now they greeted me with a nod or a smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They saw me now, not just as an old man, but as someone who had lived, who had a story, who had been a part of something bigger. I hadn't expected it, but I appreciated it. One afternoon, as I sat in the corner booth, I noticed a new face in the diner. A young man, maybe in his early 20s, sat at the counter, his eyes scanning the room, his body tense, as if he were waiting for something. I watched him for a moment, sensing a kind of unease in him, the way he held himself. He didn't look lost, but he didn't quite fit in either. After a few minutes, he glanced over at me, and then, as if something inside him had clicked, he stood up and walked over. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice soft, hesitant. "I know this might sound strange, but are you Robert Fisher?" I looked at him for a moment, surprised by the question. It wasn't often that someone recognized me, especially not in a place like this. "Yes, I am," I replied, studying his face. He seemed familiar, but I couldn't place him. He smiled slightly, though there was something almost apologetic in it. "I was told about you," he said. "The Marines who respect you. They told me to come and say thank you. They said you're someone who taught them what it means to serve, to honor the past." I was quiet for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. I had never sought that kind of recognition, but here it was, unexpected, genuine. I didn't do anything special, I said, the humility in my voice just as real as it had always been. I just did what I had to do. The young man shook his head, his eyes earnest. No, sir. You did more than that. You showed us all what it means to remember. I wasn't sure how to respond. I wasn't used to being spoken to this way, but I nodded, grateful for the sentiment. Thank you, I said quietly, unsure of what else to say. He nodded back and, after a moment of hesitation, turned and left. I watched him go, the weight of the moment settling in. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all of us, the stories we carried, the lessons we learned, and the way we passed them on. That was the real legacy. And as I sat there, I realized something. Maybe I hadn't just taught them anything. Maybe, in a way, they had taught me too. The world hadn't forgotten. It had just taken its time. And now, it felt like I was finally where I was supposed to be. The days blurred into one another as I settled back into the rhythm of life. The initial excitement of the ceremony, the phone calls, the unexpected gratitude, those moments began to fade into the background, but they left something behind. A sense of purpose that I hadn't realized I was missing. I found myself waking up each morning with a quiet satisfaction, not because of what I had done, but because of the understanding that had been given. It was no longer about recognition or accolades. It was about having lived a life that mattered, even if it was in ways that people couldn't always see. I started volunteering at the local VA center, spending my days helping with paperwork, sharing stories with other veterans, and simply offering a listening ear. It wasn't much, but it felt right. I could see the same quiet loneliness in their eyes that I had once carried. It was a strange thing, to find a place where the world seemed to make sense again. I wasn't there to save anyone or change their lives. I was there because I knew what it was like to be seen and understood, even when the world had long since moved on. There was one man in particular, a fellow veteran named Tom, who always sat in the corner, never saying much. His eyes held a story that was both familiar and distant. One afternoon, after a few weeks of seeing him around, he spoke to me. "You've seen a lot, haven't you?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded. "More than I care to remember," I said, my words coming easier now. "But it's the remembering that keeps us going." Tom didn't respond at first. He simply stared at his hands, worn and calloused, much like mine. "I don't know if I can remember anymore," he said quietly. "I think I've forgotten what it feels like to be part of something." I sat down beside him, my presence enough for him to keep talking. "It's hard," he continued. "After everything we've been through, after everything we've lost, it feels like we're just here, waiting for the end." I didn't have the answers. I didn't have the words that would make everything better, but I understood. I knew what he meant. The sense of being forgotten, of drifting through life without purpose. It was a feeling I had known all too well. "You're not alone," I said simply. "None of us are. We've all been through things that no one else can understand. But that doesn't mean we don't matter." Tom looked at me then, his eyes tired but searching. "You really think that?" he asked, his voice raw. I nodded. "I do. I think we all matter. And I think we always will." He was silent for a long time, and I didn't press him. There was no rush, no need to fill the silence. When he finally spoke again, his voice was softer. "Maybe you're right," he said, almost to himself. "Maybe I've been looking for the wrong things." I didn't know if that meant anything, but it felt like a step in the right direction. And as I left the VA center that day, I realized something. We all carry the weight of our pasts, but we don't have to carry them alone. We find our way through it, not by forgetting, but by remembering that we're part of something bigger than ourselves. We're part of each other.